Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Just give everyone another minute or so to get connected. And if anyone can give me kind of a little heads up on the chat to make sure that you can hear me correctly, that'd be great. Okay, well, in the nature of time, it's 2:01, so we're going to get started here. Um, my name is Tim McMurdo. Thanks for joining us on our In Focus session, Orchestrator Troubleshooting Tips by JDEtips. I am co-presenting with the magnificent Cindy Grimm this afternoon, and we're going to dive into some tricks and tips that we've learned throughout implementing Orchestrator Studio. So very excited to be here, excited that we have such a great turnout, and hopefully you guys will capture some good information. So JDEtips, who are we? Hopefully you've heard of us. We've just celebrated our 20th anniversary here at JDEtips. During the past 2 decades, we've empowered our clients by providing an exceptional deep dive and instructor-led training at a mastery level consulting service. So a lot of good information there from our training experience in the business. In addition to training, though, we offer up a Knowledge Express, which is a digital quarterly publication, and it offers tips and tricks related to all the different modules inside of JD Edwards, as well as technical. So, and we do provide some consulting services for a variety of different functions within JD Edwards as well. So we're available at jdetips.com. Definitely come in and check us out. As mentioned, I will be co-presenting with Cindy Grimm. She's 30 years of JD Edwards technical experience and started off her career back in the days at JD Edwards as a software developer, and she was a key developer and project lead for many JD Edwards tools that many of us use today, things such as the Crossref, Objects Library, and BizBuild, as well as the Data Dictionary admin within JD Edwards. After her time at JD Edwards, she moved into a consulting role, implementing and integrations with a variety of different clients, and then quickly transferred into the pre-sales at Oracle, which always brings a vast array of different perspectives. So Cindy's the primary orchestrator instructor at JDEtips. We've been training on Orchestrator Studio for about a year and a half now, and she's also the original creator of our course content, not just for Orchestrator, but for working with UDOs courses as well. So very successful courses, and I encourage you to again, come to our website and check out those courses.
Thanks, Tim. So let me introduce Tim. He's got over 25 years of technical experience, both as doing system administration and CNC work with JD Edwards, as well as outside of JD Edwards. And in addition to the CNC and admin, he's a DBA for both Microsoft and for Oracle. So a lot of knowledge in all of those areas. He is currently our Chief Technology Officer here at JDEtips, as well as the author and primary instructor for our CNC courses. So if anybody's interested in those, go take a look. He has a wealth of knowledge to bring to those courses. And he's also published many other articles on all the things that he has learned with the Orchestrator Studio. He did the implementation for our Orchestrator Studio setup prior to 9.2.4, did a multiple updates, tools updates on those releases, and has done our 9.2.4 and above releases as well. So a vast amount of knowledge, and has been very helpful to me as I've worked through various technical things when it comes to the Orchestrator.
Thanks, Cindy. So before we get started into the details, I am going to kick off a quick little poll here, and a little bit different. We've seen a lot of polls about tools releases and what applications you're on. So what I'm going to do is launch a poll right now. If I get you to check your interface on the top right hand side, if you don't know where the polls is, it's underneath the tabs where you see polls next to chat and people, and just an easy poll for everyone to kind of assess. So I'm interested to know how many people are actually up and running using Orchestrator Studio, or are you still in the process of developing and you're not quite live yet, or are you just in the stage of researching? So if you can take 30 seconds there and do a quick poll, and then we'll jump back into this. Okay. What's on the agenda for today? So it's all about Orchestrator and diagnosing it, troubleshooting it. So Orchestrator Studio is a fantastic tool. I think we can all agree on that. The question is, what do you do when things go wrong? So it's wonderful when you develop something and everything seems to work smoothly, but the real question is how do you keep that thing running smooth? How do you diagnose the development while you're trying to get those orchestrations into production? So we're going to talk a lot about diagnosing the orchestrations, also giving you some design considerations when you are up and developing these different UDOs, these objects. We're going to cover different tools and resources that Oracle gives you right out of the box. So things that includes things such as Orchestrator Monitor, um, Orchestrator Debugger, of course, our favorite AIS and HTML logs. And we are going to kick off this live demo. So Cindy's going to walk you through a whole bunch of different case scenarios of different types of things that can go wrong when you're creating these orchestrations. And then, of course, we'll wrap it up with a Q&A session towards the end. And if we don't get the details of your question, or you're just not ready to ask the questions and whatnot, please reach out to us afterwards. We're always love talking about Orchestrator Studio. So without further ado, let's dive into it. So very high level, but general concepts to keep in mind. Diagnosing orchestration. So there's not necessarily one rule or one solution that you apply for any type of orchestrations. There's some general practices that we're going to walk you through, things such as the Orchestrator Monitor, fantastic tool, but it really depends on the type of errors you're getting when you're creating those orchestrations. So again, we're going to walk you through those different areas of things to look at depending on the type of errors. Of course, like any development, really important to understand what that development is doing. So in this case, with orchestrations running, you have to understand the business sense. What's your objective, your source that you're trying to pull data from, and what you're trying to populate, for example. So sometimes that's out of the realm of a CNC, for example, for diagnosing those type of functions, and you have to engage your developers or your business experts to really understand the full perspective. So keep that in mind. Utilize documentation is absolutely huge. So again, there's turnover at staff. Make sure you're documenting these orchestrations really thoroughly. So when you have to go and start diagnosing those orchestrations, one of the first steps you're going to want to do is remind yourself of exactly what this thing's supposed to be doing. Some of the orchestrations can get very complex and large, and if you don't touch it for 6 months, it's difficult to remember those gritty details of exactly what's going on. So make sure to include the updates, the changes to your documentation. And again, we're going to dive into all the different tools that Oracle gives us and resources. So again, they provide a lot of good interfaces. So trying to decipher exactly what's going on behind the scenes is getting easier and easier, especially with the latest tools releases. So tools for diagnosing. I think most of you most likely heard of Orchestrator Monitor, but with good intentions, it's a fantastic tool. It gives us a very high level but very summarized information or good visibility into what our orchestrations are doing. So the successful ones, the failed ones, we can pull step information from these orchestrations that are running, see the actual error messages, those kind of things. So Cindy will dive into a lot of the details of how Orchestrator Monitor can be utilized, as well as Orchestrator Debugger, relatively new tools. I think it came out in 9243. Is that right, Cindy? Or it might have been 9241. 9243.
9243.
Yeah. So again, enhanced functionality. Fantastic because it allows you to walk through the details of what that orchestration is doing, as well as you can manipulate the data that's being fed into your orchestrations on the fly, which is a fantastic feature because you'll be able to see how that is affecting your flows. So we'll spend some time in there. And then of course we have additional resources for diagnosing. So when you run the orchestrations, there's output that gets generated from those, and we're going to show you how to manipulate that output. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. So when it's not, you have the ability to manipulate the type of data you're seeing into your orchestration outputs. And of course, one of my favorites is AIS and Jazz logs. The logs usually, I quote unquote, usually do not lie. They tell you a lot of details, and when in doubt, we can usually turn on some very advanced logging inside the AIS server as well as your Jazz logs to pull exact um, visibility of what's happening behind the scenes. So we'll definitely be jumping into that as well. Okay, so we're going to dive into a demo now. We're going to show you multiple failed orchestrations. So again, usually we want to show you a very beautiful orchestration running, and we think we've all seen that for the most part, especially at the last few in focuses and collaborates. So in this case, we're going to kind of reverse it. We're going to show you some orchestrations running, and then we're going to break them, and then we're going to show you how we troubleshoot those. So with that being said, I think we'll pass control over to you, Cindy, and you should have it.
All right, let me share. Okay, you should be seeing my screen. Hopefully you're seeing a slide that says use case 1. So with the first use case we're going to walk through is going to be adding an item into the item master. And we're actually going to use the same example of adding items to item masters as we walk through different types of scenarios. So the first one is it's an orchestration that we've created that has no error handling, and it has no manipulation of data, and it has no validation of data. So it's just hoping that whoever's running this orchestration or invoking it has sent us all perfectly good data, which we know in real life is not how it usually works. So we're going to end up with having a failure due to poor source data. And we're going to be looking at the raw error output from that. So that's going to be our first use case. So let's go in. I'm logged into the Orchestrator Studio, and I'm going to find the orchestrations that we've set up for this. And again, this is a very basic, very simple orchestration. It has just 2 objects in it. One is a connector request that's going to read a file off of an FTP server that has items in it. And it's going to process them then using the second step, which is a farm request, to add just a basic item. So if I run this, well, before I run it, I have JDEtips open. All the items that we're working with are prefaced with IF. So if I do a find, we can see that I currently have no items starting with IF in my item master. So when I run this, I'm going to first run it with good data so you see that it works. So this is I'm going to use a file called infocus new items, which is sitting out on our FTP server. And if I click run, it'll take it a few seconds. Comes back, shows us with the green circle and the checkbox that it ran successfully, and it shows that we've created 3 new items and gives us those short item numbers. If I look then at JDEtips, do my find, I can see indeed it did give me those 3 items. So we've created 3 items there within a few seconds using this orchestration. But this is when somebody was nice and gave us all good data. What happens if I have data that's not good mixed in with this? So I have another file out here that I'm going to grab and instead run it. And it's called infocus new items errors. This particular file has 3 records in it. If I pull it up and show it to you, let me go grab it. Just so you can see, very basic. Has the item numbers, description, and the stocking type, the bare minimum required to enter an item. But Q is not a valid stocking type. S is, SSS is not. So I have one good data mixed in the middle, or one good record mixed in the middle of these other two bad records. So what happens if I run this through? So if I click run, I get an error. And, I've not done any manipulation of this output, no error handling, no data validation, obviously. So what I see is mixed in with this output, I have a description of my error saying that Q is not found in user-defined code 41I. So that's basically what my problem is. And if I go look at my work with item master and click on find, nothing was added because the very first record failed. So this is what can happen if you're trying to process something in and you've done no error handling and no data validation. And you have to just kind of look through this output if you're in still a design mode and you're testing. You're using the run orchestrations to test and you get quick visibility to that output. But what happens if you want to see what the output of an orchestration is, but you didn't invoke the orchestration? Maybe it's invoked by some external third party who's called your REST service. Then that's when the monitor comes into play. So if I refresh my monitor here, you can see I did one testing it a little bit earlier. I now can see that I have a new exception in my Orchestrator monitor. And before we really dive in and take a look at that, let me tell you a little bit about the monitor. It's a very nice tool for going out and seeing how well your orchestrations are running and finding any exceptions. You'll see up at the top, you've got two tabs, a health tab and an exceptions tab. And if I look at the health tab, there's not going to be a ton of data out here, but there's some, just things that I've been running when I'm teaching classes and stuff. And what I can see is the name of the orchestration or notification. I can see up to the last 10 times very quickly when it failed, shown in red, when it succeeded, shown in green, and then some information about its success rate, what was the shortest amount of time it took to run, longest amount of time, when it last succeeded, when it last failed. And I can hone in on just orchestrations that are notifications that have failures or just ones that have successes. So that's just gives you that quick idea of the health. And if you want to see a little bit more detailed information on any of those, you can expand any of the orchestrations or notifications, get some more information about it, such as the system assigned UDO name versus the name you gave it, the environment, product code, date, time, and then it'll show you a listing of each of the times it is run, or the last 10 times, up to the last 10 times it's run, with the date, time, how long it took to run, and whether it failed or whether it succeeded. So that's the general health information. But what we need for the example we just ran is the exception information. So we see that today at about 3:15 Denver time, I ran this orchestration called in focus add item CSV. I got an exception, status code 500, and it shows you, other basic information as far as who ran it, the environment and product code. If I expand on it, again, I can see some additional information that UDO name, host address. We've got a URL. So this would be the URL if somebody wanted to invoke this orchestration. But we also have these buttons down here. And if I click on them, I can get additional information. Any of the buttons that have detail behind it that we have access to, we can click on. In this case, we have something called step trace. That's our first button. And in the step trace, it will tell you each of the steps that successfully ran. So in this case, because we've got just a basic two-step orchestration, but think if you had an orchestration that had 20 steps, trying to figure out, okay, where exactly was the failure? The last step that succeeded. So the step right after that is the one that has the problem. So that's where the step trace comes in handy when you're troubleshooting. If you want to know, okay, this particular job failed, but what was the input? you can look at the input. In this case, we just had the name of the file. So I know the name of the file that had the data that I tried to process in. So that's what the input is, just everything that you sent in. And then the exception message is going to be identical to that message that we saw in our run orchestration output. So if I scroll over to the right a little ways, I will be able to find the same thing that we had out there, that description to my error, as well as all the other information, queue not found in user-defined code. Okay, so this is a great place to come and take a look at what's going on as far as any exceptions. If you have OneView Foundation, so you've got watch list, then you could set up a watch list for any of the orchestrations that you are responsible for and be notified via watch list if you receive an error. If you don't have watch list, or if you prefer to get an email or a text message, then set up a different orchestration that goes out and looks to see if you've got any errors for a particular orchestration or notification, and send a notification or message to the people that are responsible. So you can do that very fairly easily. So Orchestrator Monitor, know it's out there and become familiar with it. You can access the Orchestrator Monitor from the Orchestrator Studio or from within E1 off of the Orchestrator menu. So that was our first use case. Let's take a look at what our next use case is going to be. Start diving in a little bit more. The next use case, we're going to, again, add an item to the item master, and it is, again, going to fail or have data that will fail because of poor, invalid information. But we're going to have some error handling that we add in. So this will allow us to process any invalid or process any of the valid records, even if there's some records in the file that aren't valid. Okay, so, and we're going to use something called continues on errors for that. All right, so if we close out of this orchestration, I'm going to get the next one down, which is add item CSV with error handling and standard output. And again, we're doing the same process here. We have exactly the same object for reading in the file. We have exactly the same form request for adding the items to JD Edwards. What's different, if I click on this form request, this last icon that shows up above it is error handling. And if I look at it in my error handling, I have the ability to enter any text I want, including any variables. So what we've chosen to do here is just something very basic and simple. We're pulling the item number and the description. So anytime I have an error, I'm saying to continue. So I'm continuing on error, and I'm keeping track of the item number and description for every record that fails. Now, you can choose to continue on error, as we're going to show in this example, but I also want to show you that when you have error handling, you also have the ability that when you encounter an error, you can say, I want to abort. And if you want to abort, then you can click on orchestration or notification or none. You could just abort and do nothing. But let's say you do have a multi-step process, and so you've got some things that have been added or updated, and then you hit something that causes you to fail. What is your business process going to be? And these are where your design decisions come into play, is how you're going to handle any particular orchestration you create, from an error handling, from a data validation. From an error handling perspective, if you decide to abort when there's an error and you've already accomplished a few steps, do you want to run another orchestration maybe that goes and cleans up that data, that so you don't have a partially processed business process? Or do you want to just send a notification to someone saying, hey, this has failed at this step. You may need to do some cleanup, or go fix this and reprocess. Or do you want to do nothing? So It's not always going to be the same answer. Different organizations are going to handle it different. Different business processes are going to require you to do things differently just by the nature of the business process. So if I run this now, and again, I'm still sitting on in my item master just these 3 records that start with IF. So I'm going to run the same file that we just tried to run before, where we got no new data entered, no new items, because the first record had an error. If I click on run this time, what happens is it tells me it succeeded. This first thing is just because I'm iterating over, so that's why it says repeating over the add an item. And I see something that says continue on air. That's because in our error handling, I said continue on air. And it tells me the step and it tells me the iteration. The iteration tells me which record in the file offset by 0. So iteration 0 is my first record. And if I scroll, kind of look down through my error message, I can see that it does indeed tell me that Q is not found in the user-defined code. And it also now has something called user-defined error text. This is what we said we wanted in that error handling. We wanted to capture the item number and the description for any record that failed. Then it goes through, it's iterating again, and this time it says iteration 2. So the third record failed. And this one failed because the value exceeded the length of the data item. And again, it tells us in our user-defined error text for that record what the item number was and what the description was. So all we did was handle the error. We didn't send any kind of notification, although we could have. And we didn't validate anything in advance. But if we go look now at work with item master browse and I do a find, I now have this IF 1005, which was that second record in the file. So it did successfully add the good record. Okay, so that's what error handling gives me. One other thing that I want to point out is if I come back over to my exceptions in my Orchestrator monitor and I click on search to see if I have more than just these 2 in the past hour, I don't. It's refreshed. When you're doing error handling and you tell it to continue on error, you've handled the error. Your result is a success from the perspective of the orchestration completing successfully. However, we know that we had data that didn't process in. So keep that in mind when you're designing these, that you'll want to make sure that you're doing something to capture this output and notify someone if all you're doing is error handling, because otherwise you're not going to be notified via the monitor that there was a failure. Okay, so keep that in mind in that type of scenario. If we look at the next use case 3, we're going to take the same one we just did, only we're going to change our output, which is something you might want to do if you're going to send a notification to somebody, so you don't send everything. You get rid of some of the noise. We're still going to do add items to item master. We're still going to use that same file that's got poor data in it, but we're controlling the output. Okay, so that's the difference of what we're doing here. So if I go back into the Orchestrator Studio, so we see what the output looks like here. It's a lot to read, but there's, some of it's good information. I have another example. Whoops. Need to get out of here. And this time I'm going to use the InFocus add item CSV with error handling. And I will go ahead and clear out my records that I created earlier. So by deleting these, we see that I have now no items in there that are going to be in conflict with anything I try to process. If I click on Start and Run, I'm going to again grab my InFocus New Items errors. So same file, two bad records, one good record, and I'm going to click run. This time we get the same, successfully completed, but our output looks completely different. And that's because I added a Groovy script that manipulates our output. And what I've done is I've figured out how many records failed. In this case, we had 2 records that failed. And I tell you what the unprocessed records are. And I'm grabbing this from the message, the data that we told it we wanted to collect, which was the item number and description for any of the records that failed. Now, I didn't, format this real pretty or anything, but I'm giving you the basic information. And if I look at my work with item master now, we still, just like we would expect, the one good record did process. We handled the other 2. And what I would say, if you were going to be doing this in a production environment, is I would wrap this in something and send a notification with this information. And that way somebody can know exactly, without having to read through a bunch of extraneous data, what failed. If I wanted to, I could have also parsed through that output to pull out the portion of the message that I wanted to include in my formatted output. And if I look at that, how do I manipulate that output? If you click on end and output, instead of just doing define output, I click on manipulate, and here's the Groovy script. And this one, I'm not going to go into all the details, but all I'm doing is I'm capturing the output, the response. And if I actually have a message, then I'm iterating through, doing a count, and I'm accumulating each of the user-defined error texts that we created when we set up our error handling, and then just spitting that all out in a string. Okay, so that is something else to consider, is what are you going to do? What do you want your output to look like? You can do all kinds of stuff with your Groovy script and get pretty fancy with it if you really want to. All right, so next use case 4. So this is all good and fine. We're handling the errors. We're manipulating our output. We'll look at data validation in a little while. But what happens if your file's not there? What kind of message do you get? We're still going to add items to the item master, but our file doesn't exist. We'll take a look at what the standard output is from running it, in both the run orchestration output. We'll see the same thing when we look at the monitor. And then by comparison, what do we see when we look at the AIS logs? They're actually going to contain the root cause in this scenario. So what I want to do here is I want to go back to the orchestration that didn't manipulate the output. And I'm going to run it. And this time I'm just going to give it a file name that I know does not exist on my FTP server, and I'm going to click run. Comes back pretty quick, gives me the little red circle with the X, and it tells me basically that I've got a general exception FTP host and the IP address for that host. That doesn't tell me what's wrong. You can, as I mentioned, get the same information in your Orchestrator monitor. So I can open it up. I can see what the name of the file was that I passed in. I can look at my exception message, and I can see it says exactly the same thing as the message in my Orchestrator Studio output. Doesn't tell me why it failed. So this is where, after thinking about it, not being sure, and maybe I don't have direct access to that FTP server to go in and look at stuff myself. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I do. But this is where I would call up my friend Tim and say, Tim, I'm having problems with this orchestration. I just ran it. If you need the time stamp, it's 15:33:49. And, it's my add item CSV with error handling. Can you help me out here?
But of course. So, and this is where it does help to for the developers and the CNCs to play along. Let me demonstrate, everyone. So, as you just saw, we tried to run this orchestration. It failed, but we didn't have enough data. So this is where your AIS logs come into play. So within Server Manager for all you CNCs, this isn't something new, but just to keep in mind, this is when it's applicable. So if I scroll down into my AIS logs, you'll see at the very last entry into it, it breaks it down into further details. So we can see right here, FTP connection, unexpected reply, 550, and now we know file not found. So nothing wrong with the orchestration, but for whatever reason, that source file that was supposed to be on that FTP server does not exist. So different troubleshooting technique at that point. Also down below, you'll see that it does talk about orchestration exception detected and it's been written out to a location. So this is an indication that it will show up in your orchestrator monitor at this point forward. So Cindy, I'll pass control back to you and we can further demo that example.
All right. Thanks, Tim. And this is where I would say thank you very much, Tim, because, now I know it's not something wrong with my orchestration and we've got something else to track down with that example. What if we look at another example? So here is going to be our use case 5. So this time, still same orchestration we're going to run, but it's going to fail because my FTP server is not available. And I'm not sysadmin or CNC. I don't have visibility into that. So I wouldn't know. So I might receive something in my monitor that triggers me to figure out why is this not working. And again, I may not know. So the AIS logs may be the root cause, and I may need a little bit of assistance troubleshooting it. So we're going to run this again. And let me double check what I have for data. Okay, so I just have this one record out here. So I'm going to run it with my good file. So I should have 3 records that run in successfully. So I'm going to click run and I get an exception. And this exception is just like the one I just got. But if I do have access to my FTP server and I go look, I see that file does exist. So I know it's there. And if I'm not looking at it from having run it in the Orchestrator Studio, maybe I'm looking at my Orchestrator monitor. I do see that at 15:37:42, I ran it again, and I could see I didn't fat finger the name of my file, so it's not that my file name's incorrect. And I look at my exception message, and again, I don't see the information that I need to have me confident in what the problem is. So this is where I would pick up the phone again or send a text message or whatever my method of communication is and say, "Hey Tim, I need a little bit of assistance here. Can you go look at your log files again and help me out?"
You're keeping me really busy. Okay, so exact same thing applies. If we pull up our AIS logs again, I'll just do a quick refresh. And we'll scroll to the bottom. So very similar to what we saw earlier, where we had the FTP file not found. If we look further down, you'll see again, this is standard AIS logs. This is not debug logs. We have not turned on the debug logs on the AIS server. This is just standard logging that will capture it. So you can see right off the bat, we know unable to connect tells us the IP address of the FTP server that's failing to connect. So at that point, a little bit different than before. Before it was the file that didn't exist. Now it's the AIS servers failing to communicate with the FTP server. So that could be credentials, it could be the FTP service is offline, it could be network firewalls preventing communication, those kind of things. In this case, we kind of cheated behind the scenes. I took the server offline, so I'll magically push this button and that should resolve the problem for this exercise. Back to you, Cindy.
All right, thanks Tim. Again, appreciate the help solving that problem. And so,
Very well.
assuming that my server, my FTP server is back online, then my next example should work. So I'm going to go on to my next use case.
Uh, are you sharing right now, Cindy?
Oh, maybe I'm not. Let me check. I thought I was, but I was not. Thank you. All right. So hopefully you can see it now. Do you see my use case 6?
We do.
Okay, great. So use case 6, venture off topic just a little bit from the error handling and validation that we'll get back to in a minute. But use case 6 versions matter, especially if you're doing anything with a form request, which we are when we're adding an item to the item master. So you can have a failure due to either an invalid version being called or somebody changing your version out from underneath you. And your standard output is what we'll take a look at to get to what the root cause is. So it'll take a little bit of understanding and a little bit of looking at the standard output. The AIS logs in this case did not give us any additional input beyond what we get from the orchestrator. So for this one, I am going to switch again back to one of the other orchestrations that I actually am allowing when we run this to change the version. And let me go show you something with this version first before we run it. So this is the P4101, the item master is the application that our form request is using. And when it was developed, we used the JDE0001, our Z1 version. And if I look at processing options for it, this is something that will be common across multiple applications within JDEdwards, where you have processing options that control when you're adding or changing something, which forms are displayed. And on the Z1 or Z1 version, all I'm displaying as far as additional fields for this very basic, simple example is the category codes form. I'm not showing additional information, storage, shipping, cost, price, or any of the other forms that you might have turned on for some versions in your environment. That matters because when we create a form request, it is expecting to hit the forms in the order that you hit them in when you do your standard processing with that version. So if I come over and I run this, as I've done a couple of times in the past, we'll make sure that okay, so I'm doing it with the file that has no errors. We'll make sure that Tim got that FTP server back online. I'm going to click run, and it should come back showing me, as it just did, I've successfully added those 3 items again. So if I go back over to my item master, I'm going to have to delete them again if I want to do this successfully. So we can see that I have the 1, 2, and 3, IF 1001, 2, and 3. I'm going to delete all of these records again and go back over to my studio. And this time I'm going to pass in a version. And if I click run on it, it's going to use this version, the in focus version that I just put in. And my error message that comes back, I've got an app stack form exception. And in it, it tells me it's expecting this form B, so W4101B, but the resulting form was 4101C. So it's telling me it didn't get what it expected in the right order. And the reason for that, if I go look at my interactive versions, come out of the one that I was in for the Z1, and I look at my in focus instead, we can see that the processing options for that one are completely different. I don't have the category codes selected, but I have all these other forms selected by putting a 1 in them. So this error can occur because of two things. One, in your design, you allowed somebody to change the version. So think about, do you want to allow them to change the version or not? Could they break it? Could they break your orchestration by changing the version if they don't know what they're doing? Number two is, if you're using, a version, especially a version that can change the sequence of events that happens, therefore breaking your orchestration, what we are recommending that folks do is they create a version that is specifically for their orchestration. And then here it's not set, but set up security on that so you don't have people going in and accidentally breaking your orchestration by changing those processing options. Okay, so that's a gotcha that I've known several people that have encountered this. So keep that in mind when you're doing your design. All right, so I think we have another one here. Use case 7. Let me bring that one up. So our next use case is going to be showing you a couple of things. It's going to show the Orchestrator debugger, and it's also going to be adding items to the item master. And in this one, we are going to actually have validation on our data as well. So it's going to have data validation, going to show you the debugger. So you're going to get to walk through the flow of the orchestration and be able to manipulate data in real time. So I'm going to use a different orchestration where we have turned on some validation. And so what this one does is it has a data request that goes out and tries to find the item number in the item master. It's doing an aggregation that's going to return a count of records that are returned or found. And then we have a rule that says, is the record found? So it's basically looking at that record count and saying, if it's greater than 0, the record's found. And in our scenario, if the record's found, I can't add it again. So, in real life, you might want to be doing an update instead of trying to force an add. In our case, we're just going to send a message saying we got an error on that add. But if the record count is not greater than 0, I haven't found the item. So I'm going to go in and then I'm going to validate my stocking type. And I'm going to use, in this case, another orchestration that actually has a couple of custom requests that goes out and uses a business function to do the validation to determine if it's valid or not. And then I use a rule to look at the output from that orchestration to say, is it found? Is it not found? If it's found, it's a valid stocking type, and then we can add the item. If it's not found, then I'm going to send out a message saying there's an error. Okay, again, a pretty simplistic example, but this one is handling the validation of the data instead of encountering an error on the ad. So, this is something else to think about when you're thinking about doing your design of your orchestration. Do you want to validate the data? Do you want to do error handling? You can do one or the other, or you could do both. And this one is very basic because I'm just validating two things. You can see where this could become a very complex orchestration if you've got 15, 20 different fields maybe that you're validating. So, sometimes you'll pull out the validation, put it into a separate orchestration, break it out. Just depends on your use case and what you're doing. But let's take a look at debug. If I click on start and run, I am now being prompted. I'm not actually reading these from a file. So I'm going to try and add something called IF 2001. I'm going to call it test item IF 2001, and I'm going to give it a valid stocking type. Okay, and just so you can see it back over in item master. If I look at IF, I'll delete the one that's out there. I have nothing that starts with IF. So if I click debug instead of run, the debugger comes up. It shows me the graphical representation of this orchestration. At each step, I can set a breakpoint by clicking on this little blue circle, and it turns into a solid blue. Okay, I can remove it by clicking on it again. On the right-hand side, I have access to see any of the inputs. If there's data from a last step or if there's output, I can see that data as well by clicking on those tabs. And then I have my controls. So if I have breakpoints, I can use the first control and it'll just run till it hits a breakpoint. And then stop at the breakpoint and then run again when you click it again till the next breakpoint. Or if I want to just step through one step at a time, I can use the second one. I can always stop the orchestration if I found my problem. I can look at what my inputs are. So I can click on this one and it'll bring my inputs back in case I've forgotten before I've started or I forgot to add them and I need to put them in. And then I can hide them again by clicking it again. I can clear out all my breakpoints instead of doing them one at a time just by using clear breakpoint, and then I can always quit debugging. We're going to step through one at a time. So I clicked on it once. It runs my first step. It succeeded, so it gives me a green check, and it's kind of outlined it in green. If it had failed, it would be red instead of green. And it tells me that out of this validate item number, my item count that came back is 0. It doesn't find it. We saw that it didn't exist. I can look at all my inputs. If I want to change one of these inputs right now, doesn't make any sense, but I'm going to change this description. Maybe I'll change the stocking type to something else. I can always see my system values as well. And there's not really going to be anything in my last step or my output yet. If I go ahead and continue on to the next step, it's my is record found. And, at every point along the way, I can make changes to any of this data. So I'll just keep changing it just so you see what happens down the road. Change this to something else. I'm going to step again. And because this was not found, it had a record count of 0. My is record found is false, which means it's going to go in and it's going to validate my UDC value. Well, and in this case, if I look, what is my currently? It's not a valid value. And I look at my validate UDC value, the results from that step say valid UDC is false. So is UDC found is going to evaluate that value. If I click next, and it's going to take me down to sending a message that there was an error on the ad. Before I click on it, my next step again though, what I want to show you, the reason I kept changing those is if I look at history on one of these fields, it'll show you for each step. And if it was done by a step, if this value was changed by the step itself, it would tell me the step. I manually went in and changed them so it shows blank, but it shows me the history of the values for that particular field. Same thing if I click on for Q. So you can see, and again, if this was done programmatically, we would see what step it happened in, and we could find out what's happening as we're walking through our process. And if I go ahead and let it finish, we can see our output, and it just kind of in this one walks us through showing us, the results of each step. If I wanted to run it again, I could click run, because at this point it failed. So if I click on find over, actually I didn't fail on that one. Or maybe I didn't delete my data a while ago. If I wanted to run it again, I could run it again. But hopefully, I just looked and it looks like we're getting close to time. But hopefully that gives you a rough idea of some of the things that you can do with the Orchestrator debugger. Let's see, what else do I want to show you? almost out of time, so let me go ahead and just do a quick summary. We by no means were able to touch on everything that could possibly go wrong with an orchestration in 1 hour. We just tried to hit some that we've seen people commonly hit up against. Um, the first thing you have to look at though is your orchestration design, and that's critical. How do you want to handle any kind of errors? Do you want to do the error handling? Do you want to do data validation? Do you want to do a combination? Do you need to send a notification to somebody if something fails? So take those design considerations into account early on in your creation in your design process. Then use the orchestrator monitor, and then become familiar with it. You can set up, like I said, notifications over the top of those exceptions that are coming through. So that's a nice way to be notified quickly if something is happening. The debugger is nice for being able to step through, being able to change values, see what happens if you do. And then those AIS and Jazz server logs, they've been immensely helpful as we have gone through, both the creation of our classes and running through just different types of scenarios. And I know that customers are using those all the time to try and, get more detail. So they're very helpful in doing so. And with that, what I'll do is just let you know we do have training. It is available. We've got Orchestrator training at JDEtips. If you're interested in learning more, we go through in detail, step by step, how to create all of the different types of components within orchestration within the Orchestrator Studio. We give you a document that shows you the step by step of everything that we do in class. That document is currently over 420 pages. In addition to the manual itself, we give you a exercise manual that's currently over 160 pages. So, a lot of material that you walk away with. In addition, we have all of the orchestrations that are created in class are exported and given to you so that you can re import them into your environment. So, if you're interested and need any training, go take a look. It's out on the JDEtips website. And there's many other training courses too. I personally teach the Orchestrator and the UDO courses. Tim teaches the CNC course, and there's, I don't know, 20, 30, 40. I don't know, Tim, how many courses do we have? It's a lot.
I think it's 27 now.
Okay. So
This is
quite a
my
few.
favorite though.
Mine too. And so with that, I think we've got 1 or 2 minutes for Q&A.
We do. So I tried to answer a couple questions throughout in the chat, but I'll specifically focus on the Q&A section here, guys. So Martin, I have seen this error. In fact, we saw this error a lot in previous versions, so prior to 924X. I don't think we ever came up with a solution. It's definitely a bug is what we were seeing. And our solution a lot of the times was to log out, log back in, but we did work with Oracle on it and don't believe we ever did get a resolution to it until we actually upgraded to 24X. So unfortunately can't give you a lot of guidance on that. My best suggestion would be to create an Oracle ticket and see if they can help you back. Cindy, can you answer this one? I don't believe rollbacks do happen in an orchestration. Is that correct?
Where's the question?
It's from Alex, and it's, can we roll back if there's an error? I think it's a manual process, isn't it?
It can be if you're talking about rolling back data that you've modified or added during an orchestration and then an error isn't encountered, that would be you would have to create another orchestration that you could automatically call as part of your error handling to roll back the data, but it's not something that is an automatic.
Exactly. And our last question from Wenjin. Does the connector step automatically build a data set slash array from the CSV file? And Cindy, do you know the answer on that one? Does the connector step automatically build a data set array from the CSV file?
If you, in your connector request, if you're doing an FTP connector and you're saying that you want to read it in from a file, and you, let me show you. Let me get out of here. So I've gone into the connector request. I have file checked. My type is receive. If you check the import CSV as array, and then you give it a data set variable name, that will create the array. In our case, I've used a file a sample file, and I clicked on file, chose my file, and it gave me the structure and the variable names for it. You could also manually enter those, but as long as you're importing from CSV as array and you've given it a data set variable name, then yes, it creates that for you.
Oh, and I think one just snuck in from Joseph. Is there anywhere you have these example orchestrations to view, copy, play with? So I can answer that. Currently, they're only available in our lab, and our students do have access to them, as well as Cindy walks through all of our students of generating many, I think it's over 30 different orchestrations throughout the course. And so then we give a copy of those orchestrations, but otherwise we don't have them publicly accessible currently. We are always looking at different tweaks though to put on our website. So it's something that we are considering to share out on our website in the future, but currently we don't have that. Any more questions?
I see one question about our contact information. So let me pull that up real quick, just so everybody has it if you're interested. If I
So
can get it to,
JDEtips.com, but on that second slide, I think we had our individual email addresses as well.
yeah, let me get, there we go.
Yep.
So we had cindy.grim@jdetips.com and Tim McMurdo at jdetips.com.
So hopefully everybody found this helpful. By all means, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question or something came up afterwards, by all means, please email us and we're more than happy. We love this technology. Cindy and I work with it a lot and very passionate about it. So we love talking to others and trying to solve orchestration worldwide problems. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll hopefully see you in live at the next conference.
Yes, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.